Witold was one of the 3 or 4 composers I've met in my life who was just a complete and utter gentleman, from a rather aristocratic family. I mean, my mother would have said, "What a well-brought-up young man." But in fact, this was a real, you felt there was a volcano in him, but he was always polite, always charming, always extremely warm, with that typical Polish feeling that all the sensations are very, very close to the skin. Anything could happen, but a real gentleman, and everybody who worked with him simply adored him. It was the players said, "Oh, we didn't like his music at all, but we thought he was the most wonderful man." It's very special. You have no idea how that helps. Composers can very, very easily get frustrated, and I'm sure Witold got frustrated on many occasions. But he would never show it. He would never want people to suffer from it. He wanted people to be given joy by his music. And he often says, "Look, if there isn't joy in this, what are we doing this for?" This was a time where composers were finding it hard to know how to notate their music. This goes back to Stravinsky being able to hear the Danse Sacrale in the Sacre de Printemps, but not knowing how to write it down, not knowing where the bar lines should go. So to see this first version where there's just all the chords but no bar lines is extraordinary. But in music of chance, where there wasn't particularly a strong rhythm, how did they notate it? And I can remember starting doing so many pieces in the 70s with the London Sinfonietta or whatever, and composers they'd worked out where to start, but they hadn't really worked out how you told people to stop, or how the next instrument came in, or how they linked together. And this is true of also great and very well-known composers like Penderecki or Berio. And Witold, thank God, worked out really the first system where you would be able to play freely, aleatorically, by chance, and still know where the next thing happened, where the this is why we ended up doing so many. Okay, this is number 1, this is number 2. Don't play, it's not number 3 yet. And he worked out all these things, so it actually was practical. And he loved the idea of, as in a fugue, when there's a number of voices working, and you have the same material. He does exactly the same thing. It's just you don't quite know where the next line starts. And so each performance will sound slightly different. And I'm sure this was also a reaction to the newfound political freedom. Because he would always say to me, "Oh no, Simon, my music has absolutely nothing to do with politics at all." And I could see his nose grow. And then in the next sentence, he would start screaming and shouting about the politicians and what they were doing. And I think, Again, maybe his conversation was supposed to be kept in the bottom drawer. But it's funny because, in fact, the first movement it's a 2-movement symphony, although there's not really a break. And the first movement was conducted by Pia Boulez, who is the last person you would imagine being involved with Lutoslawski. But in fact, the piece is so extreme in its way. It's a real 60s piece. And one has to realize, as Witold said to me, he said, "I wrote a lot of music for my deepest drawer on my desk." In other words, music that was not safe to be played. Already his first symphony had been denounced by this word formalist, the same word that was used to describe Shostakovich music. In fact, it sounds like a rather innocent folk songy type piece now, or neoclassical or whatever. But something like the Second Symphony, before the thaw had begun, would have been impossible to play. And it's the first big piece the really big piece that he wrote after he had heard John Cage. And so suddenly the idea of chance was in play. And this symphony is maybe the most extreme version of chance. And it has a real connection with the music of Boulez, to my surprise. Because Boulez often talks about how a fish moves and stops, and how these different things can collide. And of course, in his music, it's as disciplined and organized as can possibly be. In Lutoslawski's, he gives an enormous amount of freedom, but there are a lot of the same types of gestures, particularly in the first movement, which he calls hesitant. And so the first movement is it's an incredible tapestry of things trying to become and not quite managing it. And with this idea of a piece that is built up with, you expect a climax and it never quite comes until it does, is from Mahler, of course. The Mahler Fifth is the first piece where you think, here's the climax, and finally he makes it in the finale. In the second movement, there is almost a climax, but it also falls back. It's very, very theatrical, very, very gestural piece. And it still sounds extraordinarily radical and modern now. It's very, very, very impressive. Now, having played such a lot of his music, it's going to be very interesting to go back to this really seminal piece where his language was developing.